now. All right. Hey, what's up, Mr. Ippolito's and Mr. Han's students? This is Mr. Ippolito along here with Mr. Han. We're going to take you through the lesson on from Wednesday, April 29th. The lesson title is called All Night Forever. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right here so you can check out what we're doing. And we're going to take you through what you may have missed today if you weren't on the lesson today, or if we were having a few technical difficulties. So if you missed part of it, we're going to take you through the whole thing. Here we go. We don't need to talk about making good choices online, or we will go through the announcements. Why do you think, so this is the essential question, the big idea. Why do you think one former slave described his experience this way? For the slave, it is all night forever. You're going to hear that phrase again in the video that you're going to watch separately, but be aware of that. Why do you think a slave said, for the slave, it is all night forever? Be thinking of that as we go through our lesson today. The Inspiring American Women assignment, if you want to be included, that was already due, right? That was due Sunday night. But if you forgot or whatever, please make sure you turn that in as soon as possible, because we want as many students as possible, their work to be included in our special video presentation that we're doing. And then finally, your paragraph, the North, South, or West paragraph that was assigned on Monday, that is due this Friday. All right. Mr. Han, we're going to start off by doing slave conditions in the South. Mr. Han, you're going to be taking us through that, and then we're going to watch the video, which students will watch separately, and then we'll go over the primary source passages, and then we're going to finish with going over the homework. So, Mr. Han, you ready to talk about slave conditions in the South? Just kind of a brief recap. All right, take it away.
All right, so slavery in this, so we're going to be giving a little bit of background information on slavery in the South. This is just to give a little bit of information before we dig into these primary sources. Those sources get really specific, so we're just going to give a little bit of background on them before we get into it. Next slide, please, sir. So one of the things about slavery in the South was the slave codes. Slave codes, they were laws to keep slaves from running away or rebelling in the South. A few of these specific laws, these were laws that had to be followed by all slaves in the southern states. A few of these specific laws include that slaves were forbidden from gathering in groups of 3 or more. They could not leave their owner's property without a written pass. They were not allowed to own guns or any other weapons. Slaves were not allowed to own guns or any other weapons because those were the preferred tools for a rebellion. And then also an important bit right here, it was a crime for slaves to learn how to read and write. Let me say that again. Crime. It was a crime. Like, they would be arrested, and probably worse, for a slave how to read and write. All of these southern states, they had slave codes. They were not. They had their own version of slave codes. It was not just a universal code for all these southern states. One state's slave codes could be a lot harsher than the others. Like for example, the slave code in Virginia could be could be less harsher than the slave codes in Mississippi or Alabama. Next slide, please, sir. So we're going to be talking about work and related work, the work that the slaves did on the plantations. So these slaves, they worked very laborious jobs. It was very hands-on. It was a lot of work. Remember how I said last week on Monday that farming is hard? Well, this is where it comes into play here. They're working out in the fields, and mostly in the fields of agriculture with their hands. And the sun is out. The sun is out. It's just very humid out in the South. It's just very hot. And they would work from dawn before the sun came up until after it got dark. And then these overseers, these white managers who oversaw the slaves, they would whip the slaves to get a full day's work out of them. Now, one reason why they did that was to dehumanize them. Dehumanize means to remove human characteristics from someone. So these overseers and slave owners, they would whip these slaves to make it seem normal, to rationalize or make it seem normal that slaves were not human beings. So they would whip these slaves, these slave owners and plantation owners, they would whip slaves to make it seem, to normalize the fact that slaves were not human beings. They were more like commodities, like something that you would buy at the market to use at the farm, like something like a tool or something. So I think we're good here on work, sir. If we can move on to the next slide. So families. Families in relation to slaves. So none of the southern states, they recognize slave marriages. Some slave owners did allow slaves to get married, but it was purely in a business sense. Because, well, if two slaves get married and they have children, it was a source of free slaves. And this tied into the thinking of dehumanizing slaves that we just talked about. And families, they were seen as a source of strength because a family that sticks together is very strong. They were seen as a source of pride because everybody's always proud of their family, and they were also a source of love because, well, that's the main reason why people get married. Enslaved family members, so depriving slaves of their families was a method used by some slave owners to dehumanize slaves. Enslaved family members were often split up when they were sold to another slave owner or another plantation. Important statistic here is that 1 out of every 3 slave marriages in the state of Virginia were broken up by sale. So 1 out of 3 slave marriages in Virginia were broken up when the slave owner would either sell the husband or the wife or the children or the child to another slave owner or plantation. Can we move on to the next slide, please, sir? And then lastly, we're going to talk about religion in terms of slavery. By the 1800s, most African Americans, both free blacks and slaves, were devout Christians. Religion helped many deal with the horrors of slavery. Don't get it wrong, these slave owners did want their slaves to learn about the Bible, but only the parts that supported slavery. There were some parts about slavery that, there were some parts in the Bible that they preached about how slaves should be happy while as they were because they were slaves, how God made them slaves, and the reason why they were being whipped is because they did not do what their masters wanted them to do, and so those were the messages that these slave owners preached their slaves about the Bible. But a lot of it didn't stick because these slaves, they began to learn about other stories in the Bible, specifically about how these Hebrew slaves, the Israelites, they escaped slavery in Egypt. And these stories would inspire many to write and sing these spirituals. Spirituals are songs that the slaves sang as they worked in the fields. The content of these songs, they were based on Christian values, but they also described the hardships of slavery. And singing these spirituals was seen as a passive form of resistance. It was very a covert form of resistance as well, because many heard these songs and thought they were just singing about Christianity, but they were also singing about the hardships of slavery as well. So it was a very sneaky form of passive resistance. I think we're good here on the background information on slavery, sir. Yes, sir. I don't think so, sir. Not that I can think of, sir. Yeah.